Hi, and welcome to episode 59 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy and episode 9 on the YouTube channel for Finding Your Way Through Therapy. My name is Steve Bissell. Finding Your Way Through Therapy is something that it means a lot to me. And I think our guest today really is going to encompass that because I've been on her podcast. She's been very open about her experience in therapy, and I'm looking forward to that. But we were talking beforehand about names. So if you ever want to look up my full name, and I'm going to share this with everyone because it's available anyway if you look for it. My full name as a French, Canadian, or Quebecer Catholic, I grew up with Steve Joseph Peter Williams Bisson. That's my full name.
Wow.
So we were talking about her name, and I thought that would be a good start. And I want to share that I'm here with Jill Riley. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So yeah, that's why I was saying when the names, I'm always trying to be very careful. But yeah, that's my full name.
Right. Yeah. No, I just put the E.Jill Riley in so people know I'm a different person than my daughter, who also has an E in her first name. So it's just our way of not confusing, trying not to confuse insurance companies.
At the end of the day, I don't think that there's many guys with like 5 names. So I think I'm safe.
You're probably safe.
We'll see after this episode. I will not share my social security just in case. But Jill, it's nice to have you on. I've been listening to your podcast for a long time. And I was actually on your podcast. I want to say like in April. Right.
Yeah.
We're talking about that also beforehand. But yeah, post-traumatic fate is a great podcast. We'll definitely get into that too. But wanted to make sure that people know that that's how we met. And
Yeah.
I ultimately really enjoyed my experience there. So people, I'm going to link it to my podcast. So if people want to go listen to it, I thought we had a great time. But how about we start off with a simple introduction about who you are, because I know who you are, but my audience might not know.
Well, I'm Jill Riley. I live in Montana, and I was raised in North Idaho you might find this interesting, during the 80s when the white supremacists were all there. And
Okay.
yeah, so it was pretty crazy. Skinheads marching and putting buildings on, bombs on buildings and all sorts of stuff, crosses on fire on lawns. It was nuts. So then I went to Seattle and worked there and finished my education and moved to Montana. I always say I got imported into Montana because I married a Montana boy. So, and there aren't very many Koreans here. So
I was going to say, there's like 3 of you in the whole state.
I think somebody told me there's like 93 in Billings. And when you can count them, that means there's not very many.
The fact that someone took the, like, oh, and that's Jill and that's John.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Wow. So besides marrying someone from Montana, what brought you? I mean, how do you get to Montana, really?
Well, it's kind of a roundabout way. We initially moved because of family, but I also had a job here. I served as a pastor for over 25 years. And so I had a job here after I finished my graduate work. And so that definitely brought us here. And then, so I worked as a pastor for a lot of years, helped start 3 different churches, and then worked as a business consultant and did leadership development and group facilitation and all of that. And then in 7 years ago, I had a major mental breakdown and ended up hospitalized for quite a while, and began my journey on figuring out my own mental health. And a part of that was starting a blog. And after I did the blog for a while, I thought, well, I'll just start a podcast. So it was just kind of a whim of a thing, and off I went. And so that's where post-traumatic faith came from. So I've been doing that now for this is our 3rd season.
Wow. And I know that you always have interesting guests on.
I've had great guests. I've been really fortunate.
I think that that's what I really like about it. I listen to it regularly, and it's always important to me to put on the table all the trauma. And I know that you're very open about the trauma you've been through. But again, for people who may not know, can you share a little bit with my audience about the trauma that you talked about on your podcast, among other things?
Right. Well, I was in an orphanage in Korea. And then I was adopted to a family in the United States. And then they abandoned me and I was adopted to another family. And so before the age of 2, if you know anything about child bonding and parental bonding, I didn't really have a chance to do that with anybody. And then I was adopted, and my family was very, very dysfunctional. And my father molested both my sister and I before we moved at the age of, I think I was 5 before we moved, and my sister was older. She's 4 years older than me. And then we moved to North Idaho with our mother because apparently she was headed to Canada to get us away from him, but only made it as far as North Idaho. But during that time that I lived with her, we she was extraordinarily violent and very, very abusive, and just I mean, like like the kind of abusive, like I remember looking in the mirror and checking my clothes to see if there was blood seeping through because I didn't want anybody to know. It was
Jesus.
that kind of abuse. So she was very cruel and dysfunctional. The state didn't take custody of me until I was in high school. I was listed as a runaway. I was actually a senior in high school, but Idaho didn't have an emancipation law, so I couldn't like divorce my mother. So the state took custody, and then I ended up in a foster home, and then another home, and finally she abandoned me and decided she didn't want to have anything to do with me. That was in 1990. And I ran into her once, and until she died 2 years ago, she never spoke to me again. She just decided that, and this is my adoptive mother. You think that, that parents who pay for you and wait for you, that they really want you, right? It's not an accident.
No.
And she just decided that she didn't want to have anything to do with us. So that is kind of the root of my trauma. And then 7 years ago, I lost my sister to drugs. She just couldn't cope with all of the demons of our past, and so that was pretty traumatic, and was a trigger for a lot of what happened after that.
Wow, where do we go from here? I mean, there's so
I
much
don't
to be
know.
said.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's up to you where you want to go, but the first thing that comes to mind is, the formative years of our attachments are the first 2 years of our lives. It's absolutely true.
Right.
And that's really where it causes people to have anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, so on and so forth. Did that kind of like show up in your life later on? Did it show up as a teenager? Does it show up today? I mean, how did that show up in your life? I mean, that's where we can start. It's up to you where you want to go, obviously.
With attachment, one of the things that I think is that every every relationship that I have, I kind of assume that it's going to end catastrophically. Like somebody's going to get mad at me, something's going to go wrong, something is going to happen really, really bad, and every relationship is going to end. So I always kind of feel like I kind of hold a piece of myself that's an escape hatch. So in case something does go wrong, I can, just like disappear. And so that's mostly where I see my attachment issues. My psychiatrist, I've had 2 psychiatrists now that have told me this. They said, Jill, somewhere along the way, somewhere somebody loved you, and somebody helped you to be able to understand love and relationship. And I'm like, well, I don't know where the hell that was. But but they said, there's no way that you could function as an adult and a caregiver, and a service industry and a mother. Is that there's no way you could function as well as you do if you didn't have something in your formative years that was positive.
And you still haven't figured that one out yet?
Nope. Nope. No, I haven't. And obviously the first 2 years, hardly anybody has memories of that. But
Right.
but I have a major dissociative disorder, and so there's a lot of pieces of my childhood and trauma years that have just disappeared. So uh, that's always a challenge because some things I remember and some things I don't.
Yeah. And I think that with dissociation and trauma, they typically go hand in hand.
Right.
Um, it's a survival method, if you ask me.
Right.
Uh, do you feel that going through all the trauma that you've been to made, what kind of, like you said, you don't know where you got more loved you, someone loved you somewhere. How did
Right.
you adapt your life in general? Because when you go through that much trauma, you assume possibly that the world is cruel. I mean, that's just,
Right.
I'm overgeneralizing completely, and I understand, and I am. But how do we go from like thinking the world is cruel to being able to, attach to a husband, attach to your kids, attach to a community, and like three churches is nothing to sneeze at when you start up three churches. So
Right.
how do we adapt?
I attribute a lot of that to a strong community, both with in my, my college years. I had some good friends. I had some good therapists, and so I did get some psychiatric help during that time, but it was more along the lines of counseling and less along the lines of therapy. It was the first time I remember somebody telling me that I had PTSD, though, was when I was 17, and I had no idea what that meant. And we're talking late 90s, so, or early 90s, and so nobody really said, here's a specialist for PTSD. We're learning so much more now than what we used to.
Right.
but
And
but
the
I
never mind the stigma, right?
right, and we're still fighting that, right? so
Right.
so I think that I just, one, a faith community was really positive for me, having some really good attachments within the faith community. But, I met my husband when I was 19. So I was in a foster home at 17. I met my husband when I was 19 and got married when I was 20. And so, we're up on our, 29th anniversary or something. So I don't know. I just think, for me, I feel like God's played a huge part in that. And I've just been really fortunate to have help along the way as I grew, and as things became more evident that they were problematic. I've just never been left stranded.
So when you talk about God, I believe in faith tremendously myself.
Hmm.
So I'm a, I'm a practicing Buddhist, personally, and I certainly see the value of spirituality. How did
Hmm.
that help you, especially in your early 20s, especially in the beginning, to kind of like have that, you know, faith or that belief that's going to help you in the long term? Because that's sometimes hard, because God's not someone who, he or she comes down and goes, "Hey, how are you doing? I'm God. Here's what's going to
Right.
happen. Here's the deal." So I think that, how do we keep that faith, so to speak, and how did that impact you in your early years?
You know, I knew from the time that I was 14, I knew that I wanted to be in vocational work in the church. And so I felt that very strongly when I was 14. So I was always kind of in my teenage years, always kind of bent on that. And so that's why I went to school for and everything. But I think being one thing I've thought about a lot is the typical path, or some typical paths of dealing with PTSD and trauma and all of that, addiction and drinking and drugs and all of those things. Because of being in leadership in a faith community, that wasn't an option for me. I mean, it would have been an option, but that wasn't an option that I took. And so I was a workaholic, but I didn't go down some of those paths because of being attached to the faith community. But I wrote something one time about my faith in God, and I kind of described it as a life raft. I just felt like it was a life raft that kind of buoyed me through the storms, and just kept me stable to some degree, and I always had, it wasn't quite a Pollyanna view, but I always had this really strong opinion that if nobody else in the world was for me, if nobody else in the world loved me, that at least I knew that God did. And so that was And I mean, I was raised in the church. I was raised going to the church every time the doors were open. My parents were psychotic. I mean, my dad was the head of the church board. My mother was the church secretary. So I mean, we
Wow.
were we were staples in the church. They were just behind closed doors, just cruel people.
And so that's also a hard kind of like conciliation, right? You have someone who
Right.
say that they're people of faith and believe in that stuff, yet doors close and they're very, very vicious towards you emotionally, physically, sexually. I mean, this is just
Hmm.
terrible. How
Yeah.
how can you how again, I'm not trying to question God here. I hope you understand,
No, I
but more
understand.
more of a conversation here. How do we keep faith in those particular situations? Because a lot of people would be like, really, this is how fate fucking looks like behind closed doors.
Right, exactly. Exactly. I don't know, Steve. It just for me that was the anchor. That was the way that I could, I kind of imagine it like some of those, big oil riggers, that have so much weight on the bottom and so little weight on the top. I kind of felt like that was the stabilizer for me that kept things from going awry. And it's not that I didn't get tipped over, quite a bit. I mean, I've dealt with anxiety and depression and suicidality, and I've dealt with things, but may have made it through. So I'm not I don't come on here to say that I'm all better and everything's wonderful and life is, it's a wonderful life. I still have struggles, but I do think it kept me from some of the worst of what trauma can do to people.
I kind of like question. I always talk about how we're all fucked up in different ways
Hmm.
to my clients, and once you figure out one or two fuck ups, you probably a third one's going to show up, and it's okay to keep on working on it. It's just probably not as intense as you go along.
Right.
And I think that what I really like about the faith is that you can turn around to faith, because sometimes like you're crying and you don't know why, or you're angry and you don't know why, because it's so hard to consolidate in your mind.
Hmm.
Do you think that faith can help you get through those hard moments? And how have you kind of like mirrored that in the churches you help create?
Well, I think it can help you get through hard moments. I also think that if you have a positive, I mean, listen, the reason why I have attached myself to the church and why I love the church so much is for its potential. It has potential to change the world. Um, we haven't got there yet, and I acknowledge that, but I always have kind of bet on the potential that if it was good, when the church is good, it's really good. When it's bad, it's really bad. and so and so I don't know if I mirrored that for people in the church. I hope so, but I know that one of the things that was preeminent in my brain was the safety of people and the safety of children, and trying to advocate for those things, both inside the church walls and people that are outside of the church walls. So I hope that I exemplified that. And but I think my life and my witness to what I've been through speaks positively of what can happen with a life that is following some kind of a faith path.
And I think that's a little bit of what I wanted to get at, is that, for me, my journey has taken me from a very staunch Catholic upbringing in Quebec
Hmm.
to I was an atheist at some point, became more agnostic, re-embraced a little bit of the church, but ultimately at this point in my life, I'm a Buddhist,
Hmm.
and I practice. There's no such thing as a Buddhist. Practice Buddhist principles,
Right.
um, and I really like Buddhism because it just encompasses so many different values of different. If it does no harm, you can embrace it, whatever religion that is. And
Right.
my faith has helped me just really consolidate some difficult moments in my life, whether it's currently or in the past. How has your faith played a part in your life and your development and where you're at to this day? Because you've been through so much.
Yeah, I think it has been a huge piece of my life that has helped me to see the world again, like through potential. Was in a psych and trauma hospital for 2.5 months, and it was those moments that I felt like it was super dark, and I didn't feel like there was faith or hope or anything. And I've been through deep depression where I just felt like there was no light and there was no way out. I'm stuck in a well. But there's always this little piece of me that feels like I have some sense of purpose. I have some reason for being. And not only my faith, now my children and my grandchild, and those are all valid and important reasons, but I have always felt like there was just a glimmer of light somewhere. And even if I didn't know exactly what that was going to do for me, I knew it was there. And so yeah, I just have always had that little spark somewhere for some reason.
And I mean, it gets to the point where we talked about 7 years ago. You said you had a breakdown, sister
Mhm.
dies of an OD, you end up in the psych hospital. There's a lot of like dark moments in your life.
Right.
How did you deal with the stressors while you were in the psych hospitals and with everything that went down? Because it's not like you go, like one of the things I mentioned in another podcast with a few colleagues is that you don't go to a psych hospital and 5 days later you go, gee, the world's so much better. I love it here.
Right.
It doesn't work that
Well,
way.
this is kind of a funny story. I mean, my marriage was in trouble. I was losing a lot of time from dissociation. And I would literally be in the middle of conversations and have to stop people and say, I'm sorry, what were we talking about? Like I was just losing myself in so much trauma that was going on in the church. We had a lot of people that were disenfranchised and needed a lot of help, and addicts, and different things like that. And so I was just kind of being swallowed up by all this trauma. So my bosses said, hey, we really want you to go to this workshop on childhood trauma because we think that that would be good for you to kind of understand how you're reacting to all of the other things that are going on in your life. And so I went down to this workshop, and it was sponsored by this hospital. And so I went to this workshop, and on the third day, I had a major mental break, a major dissociative episode. And they said, you really need to be hospitalized. And I'm like, listen, I gave you 3 to 5 days. That was it. and and I already knew that it was super expensive. Treatment is not cheap and everything. And our church denomination, when they called them and they said, because they had sent me to this workshop, they called them and said, we really think she needs to be hospitalized. And they said, well, whatever she needs, we'll pay for it. And I'm like, oh, bastards. So,
Stop
so
being so
they,
helpful.
so I ended up going in, but because of having so many complicated trauma issues, I ended up staying about twice the time that they predicted. But no, people, you come out of the hospital and people are like, oh, do you feel better? Is everything going better? I was like, no, I feel worse, but I have better questions, you know? So you know what I mean? So I felt like I was incapacitated and kind of an agoraphobic for about 2 years, trying to recover from figuring out my life. And because of my health, and we had to close the church down, and then that was a huge source of grief for me. And because of dealing with all of the stuff that had kind of come uncorked, complex PTSD and all that, I wasn't able to work. So I went from this workaholic to full stop. So that was pretty crazy. But as far as the hospital goes, it's true. You don't come out of there and go, oh, my arm was broke, now it's better.
Yeah.
People don't understand that about psychiatric institutes. And it was experience. There was some great things that happened, but it was an experience, to be sure.
Yeah. And without being too, there's great experiences in psych hospitals, and there's experiences you'll never forget. And if you can read
Yes.
between the lines, you know what I mean.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and that's one of those examples of care that I've been the beneficiary of is, that at that time in my life was what I needed for 2.5 months. And, um, it just, that was dropped in my lap. I wasn't expecting that, and wasn't expecting that somebody would pay for that kind of treatment. I can't afford that kind of treatment. Um, and so, that's just an example of some, providential, uh, happenings in my life that have been really, really good.
One of the things you keep on talking about, which obviously I want to be clear that, I understand dissociation the way I do.
Mhm.
And I'm very big on, like, there's definitions that are given through a dictionary, and there's definitions that people mean.
Right.
So I would love to hear you kind of describe for the audience, because people don't understand dissociation. They think you're going to, La La Land, or you're like on planet Mars when you do that, or something like that. And I think that
Feels like it some days.
right, that's what I mean. But how would you define it so that people can kind of like not necessarily, I don't know if relate's the right word, but certainly understand it better, because I don't think that
Right.
people quite get what dissociation means.
Well, everybody dissociates. And it's like if you're, driving down the road and you're 3 exits past where you're supposed to be, and you're like, where was my brain? You just kind of check out. Or you're watching a movie and you realize you're half an hour past what you remember last. It's a matter of, just kind of escaping into yourself and into your brain. What happens with a dissociative disorder is it becomes a maladaptive response. So what was a good response, like it under abuse or under attack, especially children, can learn to disappear into their own brain so they can tolerate what's going on,
Right.
and know what's going on. eh, Know what's going on, but not, be really aware of, the pain and all of that. But as an adult, anytime there's a threat or a trigger, you switch into that dissociative mode that becomes maladaptive. It's no longer useful. It no longer has a purpose in your life. But if there's a trigger, then you're there. For me, I've been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, which people freak out about because that was formerly known as multiple personality disorder, and people just kind of, just completely freak out when we talk about that. But
Thank you,
it was
1980s
just
movies, by the way.
yeah, it still happens. There's still ones that come out. But people think that is all of a sudden you become a different person, you're dressed different, you show up different. It can be an internal thing too. So my
Right.
my other pieces of me are all very internal. My therapists know, and my psychiatrist knows when there's another piece of me that's really talking. So a younger part of me or an older part of me, they know when that's happening. But when I'm in an untriggered environment, that's not part of my conversational day-to-day life.
Right.
That
And
does that is that a good complete explanation of dissociation?
I think that explains it a whole lot. The way I describe it sometimes too, you talked about 3 exits later. I tell people, like, have you ever been in, you get out of work or get out of someone's house that and you drive home, and you get home and you're like, how the fuck did I get here?
Yeah.
And that's dissociation. I think that the way you just described it is a great way too, and I think it's very helpful for people to understand, because I get frankly frustrated with mental health, how it's depicted sometimes in the media and
Hmm.
stuff like that. Yeah, dissociation. I come from the school that we all dissociate, so thank you for saying that. Number one,
Yeah.
we don't necessarily dissociate because of complex PTSD. All of us, some of us do have PTSD and relate to that.
Right.
But I think it's also important to realize that, it doesn't show up the same way for everyone, and it's
Mm-mm.
okay. And it doesn't have to be this, multiple personality disorder shit that we used to see on TV or still media
Yeah, Three
infused.
Faces of Eve, United States of Terra, all of those different shows. What was it? Oh, I can't remember. There was another one. But all of these different shows that depict that, where, there's this big bad evil part of you that comes out and kills everybody. It's not that for me. Now, I do have a friend who has a dissociative disorder, and in her world, her escapist world, she has created a whole environment that is very, very intricate. And I think that's really interesting. But again, everybody handles it differently.
And I think that I don't know if you were thinking about I don't know if you were thinking about Homeland when you were thinking about the other one. But Homeland, I find, as a depiction of bipolar that's actually done fairly well because
Okay.
people don't get. I have a good friend of mine. She has suffered from bipolar for a few years. Um, and it's never quite depicted properly in the media, so that's why I get annoyed. But people look at Homeland as possibly that. Now it's she gets into hypomania and how she reacts to different
Okay.
things. So, but they're like, oh, dissociate. That's not dissociation. That's hypomania. And I don't want to get into a detailed conversation about everything that can be depicted negatively in the media, but I appreciate you talking about the dissociation. Um,
Yeah.
Dissociation does not need to be related to trauma, but it usually is, in my
Mhm.
opinion. It can be dealt with different ways, and when you go through moments in your life when you're not even like, I'm pretty sure you weren't always cognizant that you're going through dissociation, and that
No.
can be very difficult for people to understand that you're in a different world, so to speak. And
I knew when I was in high school, I knew that I was losing time. And I didn't know what it was about. I found out one day somebody brought something up that had happened 3 months ago, a really violent attack, and I just had totally forgot. And so I didn't know what to do with that. I was like, why in the world wouldn't I remember that? I mean, my mother literally picked me up and threw me across the room, and I didn't remember that. And so that was when I first noticed it. There are years of time when my kids were little that I'm in and out. Like I'll look at pictures of myself with my kids or videos of myself with my kids. I know I'm there because I see it represented, but I don't have like physical memory or, of being there. So I'm detached from that image, on the screen, even though I know I was present. But when it came down to having so much stress from working so much and stress from the church and people in the church, I was losing time. Like I was driving around half the day, not knowing where I was going and not knowing what I was doing. And like I said, I was in the middle of conversations and I would just black blank out. And I studying was super hard, and that's a large part of a minister's job, and studying was super hard. My concentration was super bad. And so it was just like these things, everything was starting to come unraveled.
and getting to a point where you're able to realize all those things, does that bring any particular emotions on your part, like when you really realize all these lost moments in your life, so to speak, because of the dissociation? Because I know that for me, I've had clients express shame around it. And I'm
Hmm.
like, well, there's no shame to be had. I get where you're coming from. There's no shame to be had. It's not like you said, oh, I'm going to dissociate starting now. No, you
Right.
didn't. You didn't.
Right.
So I don't know if it brought so many emotions on your part or anything like that. I just want to ask in case.
Well, being diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, a dissociative disorder, another type of depression, being diagnosed with all of that, I felt like for quite a while that was really shameful. That I was completely broken. And to know that those things could become better, but they were a part of my life now, whether I liked it or not, felt like a brand. Somebody had branded me, and it was just this permanent, scarring that happened. I've gotten past that. The one thing that I don't talk about is the dissociative disorder because of people not understanding that too well, and takes too long to explain. Um, but when it comes to memories of my kids and of times, I have I have a wish. I don't have shame. I wish that I remember physically being there. I'm glad that I was able to parent the kids. They're great kids. I have 4 of them. They're fantastic people. I was really fortunate with that. And, but I do wish that I could have been more, I was present, but more mentally present.
Right. And I wasn't obviously implying that you needed to have shame. It's just something that I need, like
Right.
for,
No, it was there. It definitely was there.
well, and I think that that's what I appreciate. I want to thank you for being so honest about everything that you've been through, especially around dissociation, because this is not something that most people are kind of like willing to have a conversation, because it's a hard conversation to be had,
Hmm.
even if and you've had that diagnosis, but even someone who's never had that diagnosis, they start talking about it and they can't go into it. So I really
Right.
want to thank you for that. I appreciate it. This is really the goal of this podcast, is to really break down those walls so we can have these conversations. So I just want to say thank you before we go on.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And it's a learning, right? I've had to learn to learn more about it and figure out what it's all about before I could say, hey, this was a really useful tool that just became maladapted and we need to work on that. And instead of feeling like it was a scarlet letter,
And,
because that's how I felt at first.
well, I can't believe in 2022 we still see mental health diagnosis as a scarlet letter.
Right.
You know, it's something that my view is that, when you someone breaks their arm, how long did it take to break an arm? 2.5 seconds. But then you got to be in a cast or get rehab for 8 to 12 weeks. And that's
Right.
super acceptable. When you think on the percentage wise, it's kind of really weird that a 1.5 second break is going to take 8 to 12 weeks. And I tell people in mental health, it's the same exact thing. We go through a lot of trauma or any type of diagnosis. I say trauma
Hmm.
because that's just one of them. You're going to go through it for a year, six years, whatever the case may be. The treatment is going to take long. It's not going to just go like, oh, 6 years of trauma. Give me 3 weeks, you'll be fine. I
Right.
mean, I mean, it doesn't work that way. But we're okay with that on the physical health view of the world, but we're not okay with that on the mental health view. So I appreciate
Here's my premise. I think until we begin to refer to mental health as physical health, we're not going to break down that barrier. It's as if everything from the neck up is separate from the rest of the body. Well, my neck and my body are all attached. And so I think until we begin to recognize that dealing with mental health is as much physical health as diabetes or cancer or heart disease, until we start to look at our brains, minds, emotions, and souls in the same capacity, we're going to be running behind the eight ball.
It's something that I talked about in a previous podcast with another guest who's a police officer. And he was saying, how come we can talk about this down here? Now that I have video, I can show you that. And then anything that's up to here, we can't. And they said it's even weirder because if I had like a big mark in my face, you'd be like, you'd be like, I don't know if I can bring that up or not. But if I had it
Right.
on my arm, you'd be like, hey, what's that on your arm? That's how
Yeah.
bad it is talking about whatever's up to here, because even a facial deformity,
Right.
whatever you want to call it, uh, we wouldn't talk about. But if it was on my arm, they'd be, hey, what the hell is that? So
Yeah,
I think it's
exactly.
really screwed up that we think about it. I like your definition of how we need to see it as equal and not separate.
Right. Yeah, I think until we do that, we're going to be running behind for sure.
Well, I tell people I have a therapist, love my therapist, and I have a doctor, love my actually she's an NPPA. I don't want to insult her. She's great, but I would never give up one or the other ever. I need both.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
not going to be shamed ever into having both. So it's
Right.
something that we need to kind of lift that stigma too.
The other thing that I had a lot of shame and challenge with was medication. I'm on 11 different medications a day, from, depression and anxiety and antipsychotics and all sorts of stuff. And medicine to help the depression, medicine and medicine to sleep. And I I really felt shameful about taking medication. And I think that is an example of where the church has got it wrong, because the church so often equates your spirituality and the strength of your spirituality with the ability to heal yourself when it comes to mental health. And so much of that, I think, is problematic.
I agree.
Yeah. So I just really felt like, I should pray harder and do better, and medication was something that wasn't great. And now I don't see it that way, but that was something that I was very conflicted over.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't want to speak for any of our spiritual leaders from the past, but I'm pretty sure that Jesus would have let us have a pill that made us feel like we can sleep better or we can deal with our issues better. I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure Jesus wouldn't have said, "Just pray harder."
right.
Again, I don't want to speak for Jesus. But I'm pretty sure he was the type of guy. Hey, if it works, it works. I
Yeah.
could see a lot of our spiritual belief systems, and you go, and I don't want to go at, Abraham to Ganesh to Buddha to whoever. I mean, I'm pretty sure all of them would have been, yeah, if it helps you, go ahead. I don't think they would go like, you didn't pray long enough that day, or you didn't look at Mecca
Right.
enough. And so I'm not, again, picking on any particular religion. I'm just talking in general here.
Yeah,
But
I
I,
think in general, faith communities haven't done a great job with this.
Well, I would argue too that even in the addiction community, we have a big issue with that too, because I still hear it to this day. Oh, you're chewing your drug. Wait a minute. Well, Wellbutrin keeps me from like going into deep depression during the winter time. I'm not chewing a
Right.
drug. I'm just trying to survive. And you see that in the addiction community. You see it even with people like, do you really need meds? I've seen medical doctors say that to people because, again, the mental health and physical health are seen as
Mhm.
like, why are we shaming people for this crap? I don't understand.
Yeah. I have my psychiatrist right now is really interested in this medication affects your cholesterol, and this medication affects your heart rate, and we need to look at that. And I really appreciate the interlacing of both my physical health and my mental health. And I think that's really positive, because I've had psychiatrists that are very interested in my mental health but not my physical health. And it's really great to have somebody who deals with that intersectionality.
And I think it's important to interview our treaters that way, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
my new NP, or again, I don't want to say it wrong. I want to say she's an NP. I can't remember. One of the things that I said is that I did not need Wellbutrin this winter, but I do take Wellbutrin for my seasonal affective disorder. I have PTSD.
Hmm.
And the first example was like, I'm so happy I was going to ask you mental health question. Really? That's even better.
Yeah,
And so make sure you choose your providers accordingly, to me anyway,
absolutely.
because I've seen too many providers. Like, I have people who call me as a therapist and they're medical doctors. Oh, I don't know anything about depression. Your medical doctor, you should at least know slightly a little bit about depression or anxiety or bipolar or schizophrenia. You don't need to know the whole thing, but you should have at least a vague idea. And you
Again,
got
because those things affect our physical bodies, because it is all physical. So yeah, I think we've got to treat it all.
Well, the mind, body, spirit to me is just the whole, the design of a human belief system. To me, anyway,
Yep.
that's how I see the human. If you don't address the body, you don't address the mind, and you don't address the spirituality. And it doesn't matter how you treat all these things as long as you treat them as equals on a bigger pyramid.
Yep.
Just my thought.
Yep. Absolutely. I agree.
So let's shift gears a little bit, because I think that what we're talking about in different ways is that we're talking about, having some people having the, mental health or trauma informed thought processes. And I've seen some movement in that way, in a good way, from businesses from other
Hmm.
parts of the world, of our culture, I should say. But I still think that there's a lot of different difficulties that come with that. How do we better inform mental health and uh, trauma informed people in general? How do we work on that?
Well, I think what you're doing and what I'm trying to do is tip of the iceberg, which is we've got to talk about it. We've got to be able to have normal conversations about it. And in a lot of ways, just normalize the conversation so it doesn't freak people out because there's no reason for that. There's just no reason for it. And I think that's paramount is being able to talk about it and bring it out in the open and not make it so cloistered and closeted. But I think that, there are industries like, like businesses that are dealing with trauma informed care. But I think, our teachers need trauma informed care because, information because they are dealing with traumatized children. I think there's I can't think of a place in the world where there isn't people that have been traumatized that need to have people who understand what trauma is and understand some of the triggers and understand how to deal with it. I just think it's super, super important. And I think we are getting better at it. I agree. But I think we have a long ways to go.
It was a conversation I had recently with someone who works in the medical field who is, I was talking about being mental health informed. Well, I asked them
Okay.
if they're okay. That's not being mental health informed. That's you trying to sweep it under the carpet as fast as you possibly can.
Right.
Um, how do we explain to people to be somewhat curious about mental health, with knowing that maybe they're not a treater per se, but at least be curious about mental health? Do you have any suggestions for that?
You know, I don't know. I think it's basically, I would say it's dipping your toe in the water and just saying, can I have this conversation with you? Can we talk about this? Listening to things and reading things that will inform people about the enormity of this problem and the possibility of treatment and the potentiality of what care can do. I think people have to be willing to be curious. And I think if we're more curious, then we want to know more answers.
And I think that raising that curiosity level, I
Yep,
think that there's that's going to be part of the long term thing. I tell people, if someone's having a hard time, instead of being gossipy about are they having trouble in their marriage, are they having trouble with whatever, how about you be curious about their mental health so they can feel better about themselves and that you feel like you
absolutely.
contributed. That's just my view, but I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what keeps us from that is fear that we're stepping on the wrong thing, that we're doing something inappropriate or, untoward. And we just got to get past that. We've just got to get past that as part of our worldview and be able to talk to people.
And I think that, you hit the nail on the head when we think about trauma and mental health informed people. I think fear is the biggest factor because mental health, we conjure up one flew over the cuckoo's nest, or we
Right.
conjure up these stories. And mental health is me and you. I have zero
Right.
qualms about sharing that. I've said this on my podcast numerous times. I'll say it. I've got a mental health issue. My therapist recently said, like, you know, are you okay with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder? I'm like, I don't really care what my diagnosis is. I know I have mental health issues.
Yeah.
And he's like, that's good because most people get upset about the label. I said, if it gets me the help I need, then I don't really care. I,
Right.
I think that we need to just work on just killing the stigma of mental health and being honest. Like that's what I love about your story. And that's what I hope you continue doing. But do we get more people talking about their mental health issues, or is that just not possible nowadays?
I think it's possible. And again, I think we've got the ship headed in a better direction than it has been. But I think this is something that my psychiatrists say to me a lot is they're like, this is a rudimentary medicine. We are dealing with a relatively new field. When you think the first DSM came out during our lifetime, it came out in 1980. And that was the first diagnostic manual that they had for mental health. And we didn't even start talking about we started talking about people having manic episodes and people having problems, but we didn't start talking about PTSD until World War II and the shell shock, you
Right.
know. So and that was that was in some of our friends' lifetime. And so really we're one generation into this conversation of it really being open. So I think we also have to be patient with ourselves.
I mean, when you think about that, I think about William James and I think about Sigmund Freud. I
Mhm.
mean, my grandmother was alive when they started talking about this, my great grandmother,
Right.
perhaps. That's not ancient history.
Right.
This is, and, we were doing medical treatment even in the Greek history of Aristotle and all that. So we're really early in our development. Yet, you look at the neuroscience that we've developed over the course of several years, it's been very helpful for us.
Right.
Um, I have a colleague of mine who always says, we'll be long dead, but maybe one day we'll be able to go, all right, that's the part of the mind we really got to work on. And here are the techniques to do so. I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, not in my lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a really good reminder for myself and for others, is just that, we are dealing with something that's still a little rough, and we're in the refining processes that we will continually be in, to figuring out mental and emotional health and regularity.
Well, I really appreciated your time today and thank you so much. But what I would love you to tell me is a little more about your podcast because I know what it is. I've listened to it, but can you tell me more about
Yeah.
it?
Well, post traumatic faith is really about the intersection where trauma and hardship and challenge and adversity meet with faith and hope and steps towards the future. And so we talk about faith sometimes. We talk about we talk don't talk about faith sometimes, and it's just really about what gives people the will to go on, and the purpose in that they found in the process, and what has brought them through. I'm really interested in the journey, not so much the destination, and not so much the feeling that I've arrived at, all of the things that I always wished I would be, but I'm interested in the journey. And I think that in our westernized world, we're so about the destination and linear. First this needs to happen and this needs to happen and then you die. And I just think we have to be more curious about people's journey.
Well, I think that the journey is actually the fun part, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I tell people like that's the fun part where we still don't know too much where we're going to end up. So it's both exciting and scary for people talking about fear.
Yep. Absolutely.
So where can we find post traumatic freight?
Well, you can find Post Traumatic Faith on any of the podcast providers. If you want to know more about where to find out more information about me and get the podcast, JillRiley.com, JILLRILEY.com is where everything in the blog is all kind of centered at. Haven't been writing regularly on the blog for quite some time, but it exists. I keep thinking I'm going to get back to that, but it's one of those disciplines that's hard fought.
I mean, well, I think that you have what I would consider a blog anyway. It's called your podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
But show notes will definitely reflect that your podcast, obviously, and your website. Um,
Awesome.
any other way to reach you or follow you?
No, I mean, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, not on TikTok. Have a friend had a guy who was working with publicity recently tell me, Jill, you got to get on TikTok. And I'm like, I am almost 50 years old. I am not going to get on TikTok and start doing TikTok dances to attract people.
I'm not going to do a TikTok dance, but we could talk off air. But I've been told to do the exact same thing from someone else. And
Yeah.
I'm actually going to get on TikTok maybe by the time this is released. So,
Oh,
yes.
well, let me know how it works.
Oh, I believe me, I'm not dancing to anything, and I don't even know what the trends are anymore. I'm just an old man myself, so I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Jill, thank you. I hope we reconnect soon. I have a couple of
Absolutely.
ideas that we should reconnect, and I'll talk to you off air about it. But thank you.
Right. Well, thanks for the conversation.